Welcome to the third video in our Matching Accessibility Resources to Student Needs training series. Now that we have a clear understanding of the why and the what regarding accessibility resources, let's spend some time exploring how to best assign and use these resources during daily instruction and for classroom assessments, as well as for assessments available on the CASP and LPAC to ensure equity for all of our students. You may notice that we often refer to using these resources on a regular, if not daily basis to provide all students access to learning and assessment. Not only does this help to provide more equitable opportunities for all students, but it also provides students the time to become familiar with the accessibility resources prior to the CASP or LPAC assessments. It is not recommended that students are assigned resources that they are not familiar with. The California Individual Student Assessment Accessibility Profile, or ISAP tool, is another tool that can help match the student's needs with the appropriate resources. The ISAP tool is used to find detailed information about available accessibility resources and plan for entry into the system that CASP and LPAC coordinators used, called the Test Operations Management System, or TOMS. Keep in mind that the ISAP tool is not a requirement for identifying accessibility resources, but just one of several options available to LEAs. The ISAP tool is now available online for LEAs to use. And I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a quick live demonstration of how to use the ISAP tool. So the ISAP tool can be accessed at the following URL, all lowercase, isaap.ets.org. The ISAP tool can be used to match student need to appropriate resources. It's important to keep in mind that the tool doesn't store student information or accessibility resources from one session to another. So it's important to save the data to an external file at the end of each session. And I'll walk you through how to do this. Also, notice that there's a user guide that you can access for detailed information on using the tool. So the first thing you'll want to do is select which assessment you're wanting to match accessibility resources to a student. I'm going to go ahead and select CASP, and then you'll click Get Started. So here is where, if I had already gone through a session and I had a file saved, I could select the file. I don't have a file saved yet, so I'm going to click Add Student Manually. And again, details for doing that are in your user guide. So here's the CASP student information detail, and I'm just going to put in just test. You do have to put in an SSID or it will not let you go any further. And I'm just making one up. And I'm going to select a grade. And you would fill out all of the additional information. So now I'm going to scroll down here where it says accessibility resources. Notice it has which content area I'm working on, because each one, remember we said the accessibility resources vary by content area. So I'm going to choose the one I'm working on now. It also gives you the key to all of the different assessments. And so the first thing I'm going to check is the method for which I determined student need. This might be by an educator recommendation, or it might be by an IEP or 504 plan. What you check here really makes a difference on what accessibility resources will populate. Because remember, accommodations are those only available to students on IEPs or 504 plans. So first, I'm just going to hit educator recommendation. The next thing I'm going to check is what are some of the students' needs. So I'm going to select, notice it has support for executive functioning and some examples of what that is, support for persistent calculation disability or dyscalculia, reading related disabilities, and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and check support for students needed access in language of translation. And notice when I did that, some accessibility resources populated up here into the designated support section. Notice none populated for accommodations because I didn't check IEP or 504 plan. So notice some possible supports I might want to try with a student are populated here: bilingual dictionary. And if I want to know more about it, I can just hover over the question mark and it tells me a little bit about that particular resource. Simplified test directions, I can hover over that, separate setting, etc. So I want to select one. I'm going to select bilingual dictionary and I'm going to select it there. And maybe I'll select simplified test directions. Once you're done selecting the resources you're going to provide to this particular student, you want to save. Remember, it doesn't save from one session to the other. So you're going to save and view student list. And now I have one student added. Again, I'm going to save this to my ISAP files so I can retrieve it later and I can upload additional students. So that is a quick demonstration on how to use the ISAP tool. Again, the user guide has lots of detailed information on how to use the tool. So in addition to the ISAP tool, another tool that can be used to match student need to available accessibility resources is the Accessibility Resources Planning tool, which is available in your resources. So if you'd like to go ahead and go access that, and then I will walk you through it. This tool organizes many of the accessibility resources that are available according to their connection to the UDL guidelines. As we saw in our exercise, this is not an exact one-to-one correlation, but you may find this a helpful tool in connecting the needs of students with the appropriate resource. So let me walk you through it briefly. Notice it starts with the key, U for universal tool. Remember, these are available to all students. DS for designated support. These are available to all students for whom a need has been determined. And A, accommodation, and these are available to students with an active IEP or Section 504 plan who have a documented need. Another thing I want to point out is, unless otherwise noted, the accessibility resource type applies to the CASP for ELA and mathematics assessments, the CAST, and the LPAC. So notice the document is organized according to the 3 UDL principles: engagement, representation, and action and expression. And notice that the resources listed underneath, that those that are available according to their connection to each UDL principle. For example, earlier we talked about breaks, supporting students' need around engagement. So I see the name of the resource. I see you telling me it's a universal tool, and then followed by the common classroom practice. So in the classroom, students might pace themselves while completing work. They may take breaks outside to refocus. Similarly, there's resources that support the area of representation. Our English learners might benefit from an English dictionary. Again, here's the U, it's a universal tool. And then in this case, it tells me on which particular assessment type English dictionary would be a universal tool. This would be for the ELA full-write performance task. The classroom practice would be for students to use an electronic or paper English dictionary to look up word meanings. Same idea with the area of action and expression. You'll see some resources that would support student need. So really, your educators can use this as a menu of options when helping to identify which accessibility resources would be appropriate to support student needs. Okay, so in a moment, you'll have an opportunity to practice actually using the tool. Before we discuss the steps involved, in the identification and selection process, I'd like to introduce you to Marco. We're going to use his case as an example as we work through the identification selection process. Let's take a moment to review some of his learning characteristics. We can see that Marco is in grade 4. This is his second year in a US school. He speaks fluent Spanish and has a good understanding of science concepts when the textbook and instructions are translated for him. He reads at a 2.0 grade level equivalency. He finds it helpful to read aloud when reading English text. He often gets discouraged when there's too much text on a page because he's still developing foundational reading skills. On the LPAC, he has tested at a performance level 2, which is somewhat developed. So the appropriate selection of resources to support student needs focuses on identifying both student strengths as well as needs. I'd like for you to take a few moments to think about Marco's strengths and challenges that can help us think about needed accessibility resources. Please pause the video and capture your responses to the guiding questions on your note-taking guide. What are Marco's strengths that can help us think about needed accessibility resources? What might be some challenges to Marco demonstrating what he knows and can do that can help us think about needed accessibility resources? And finally, what data is currently available on what sources of information can help us clarify Marco's strengths and needs? Go ahead and pause the video and restart when you are ready to go on. So here are some ideas that you might have come up with as you were thinking about Marco's case. Some of his strengths that you might have identified are that he's a fluent Spanish speaker, that he has interest in science, and that he's developed coping strategies to overcome challenges to reading when he uses reading aloud and tracking. Some challenges that you might have identified are that he's currently reading below grade level, that he gets discouraged when there's too much text on a page, and that he's still at the beginning stages of English language development. Some data that can help us better understand Marco's needs are his current LPAC performance level, which is a 2, somewhat developed, and that he's currently reading at a level 2.0 grade equivalency. Some additional sources of information that can help us clarify his strengths and needs might be to discuss with his parents or guardians and what has worked at home for him. Definitely bringing in his teacher, right? What things are working in the classroom for him. I can analyze additional student performance information. I can talk to the English learner coordinator and also his CUME folder for additional information. So now that we've identified Marco's strengths and the challenges that might keep him from demonstrating his learning, we can begin to think about which category or categories of resources we might consider trying with him. Remember, the areas of accessibility need are engagement, representation, and action and expression. In which areas do you think Marco might have accessibility needs? Let's think about the category of engagement first. His identified learning characteristics include that he gets discouraged when there's too much text on a page. This can be a challenge for him during instruction and on assessments. Therefore, I could say he has accessibility needs in the category of engagement. The next step is to match his accessibility needs to available accessibility resources. That's where our accessibility resources planning tool comes in. Here we have a menu of options that we might consider trying with Marco to help him overcome challenges to learning during daily classroom instruction and testing. Let's begin again with the category of engagement. Let's consider what resources we might try with Marco to help him overcome his needs in the area of engagement. His teacher might consider using masking with Marco during classroom instruction. During instruction, Marco can use a note card to cover up sections of the text he is not yet reading to help him maintain visual attention. The teacher could also teach Marcos to use digital masking tools. If Marco is successful using this resource during classroom instruction, the teacher should consider practicing the masking resource in a practice or training test to ensure Marco is comfortable using the resource in a testing platform. Let's move on to the category of representation. Because Marco is a struggling reader, he might benefit from accessibility resources in this area. Let's consider what resources we might consider trying with Marco to help him overcome his reading difficulties. Notice text-to-speech is a designated support that might help Marco overcome this challenge during instruction. During instruction, his teacher can have him listen to the audio version of his text or books. If this resource is helpful to Marco during classroom instruction, the teacher can have him practice using the resource again on a practice or training test to help him become comfortable using the resource in a testing environment. Finally, let's consider the category of action and expression. Because Marco is at the early stages of English language development, he can benefit from accessibility resources to communicate in English. Take a moment to consider what resources we might try with Marco in the category of action and expression to help him overcome the challenges to communicating effectively given his current level of English proficiency. You might consider here using a dictionary to help Marco look up unknown words to use in his writing responses. A variety of sources of information should be involved in the decision-making process, and there should be some type of documentation of the identification and selection process. Some sources of information that should be used when identifying student needs are educational history, parent or guardian input, language proficiency information, language of instruction, academic performance, physical and medical information, and the resources currently or previously provided in the classroom, and information solicited from interested educators and others, including students themselves. When identifying student needs for the use of resources on the CASP and the LPAC, there are no specific or detailed requirements for the decision-making process, but some key requirements should be kept in mind. As was mentioned earlier, initial identification of student accessibility needs should begin at the classroom level, since teachers know the most about their students' learning characteristics, including individual strengths and challenges in daily classroom instruction and on classroom assessments. Additional sources of information that can be used to support accessibility decisions for each and every student include classroom data, parents and guardians, like we mentioned, and again, students themselves. Educators can collect student performance data with and without the use of accessibility resources to determine what resources benefit each student the most. Parents or guardians can contribute information about their students' needs and about strategies that they found helpful at home to meet those needs. This information may help the team make appropriate choices of particular accessibility resources for the benefit of the student. Students are perhaps the best source of information. Informal interviews can provide a wealth of information as to what learning challenges students are experiencing and how they can best be supported. Individual needs must also be considered for students with IEPs and Section 504 plans. The goal for students with IEPs or Section 504 plans is to provide appropriate opportunity and access to assessments by considering each student's cognitive, physical, and emotional needs. In general, the IEP or Section 504 plan teams make determinations for the students based on their individual needs, including participation in any alternatives to the existing English language assessments. They recommend the use of accessibility resources that will help measure what the students can do and assess them on the basis of their current level of development. In some cases, the IEP or Section 504 plan will specify that the student should take the California alternate assessments instead of the Smarter Balanced Summative assessments for ELA and mathematics and the CAST, and the local alternate to the LPAC or alternate LPAC. The goal is to ensure that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are offered a developmentally appropriate opportunity to take and access the assessments. Finally, to ensure accessibility resources truly support students to best demonstrate what they know and are able to do, students need exposure and lots of practice. Educators should be familiar with student access needs early in the school year to provide them with the necessary resources on a daily basis to access classroom instruction and assessment. Testing should not be the first or only time educators are thinking about and using these accessibility resources with students. Students should be familiar, comfortable, and confident when using resources related to their individual needs. Students are most successful using accessibility resources on the summative assessment when they have had multiple opportunities to practice with those resources in a testing environment. Students can be provided with one-on-one targeted instruction on the use of accessibility resources using the training tests. Teachers can also make the accessibility resources available on the practice tests and assign them to students for the interim assessment. Remember, accessibility resources provided on the CASP and LPAC ensure equitable access for students with diverse accessibility needs and preferences. The CASP and LPAC were developed using principles of universal design and research-based best practices so that the students who take them, including students who are learning English or have special needs, can participate in the test meaningfully and demonstrate what they know and can do. But these are not the only students who should be considered for use of accessibility resources during daily instruction and on assessments. All students can benefit from accessibility resources that address a variety of access challenges, allowing all students to show what they know and are able to do. Thank you so much for having joined us today. Hope that you will join us for the live virtual follow-up, that we can apply some of our learning today and ask any specific questions about your students. Thank you so much for attending this training session.